Kamala Harris is not fit to be president of the United States.
America, we know what Donald Trump has in mind. More chaos, more division, and policies that help those at the very top and hurt everyone else.
So it's being called as the closest election, perhaps in a generation for America. Right now, most of the polls are locked in a dead heat between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Less than a percentage separates the both of them. Even in the battleground states, there isn't any poll that seems to suggest that one of the two candidates has a decisive lead. So what do we make of this, and which way is America likely to swing come November 5th election
What
day?
do we make of it is it's going to be very close. I always say polls have a margin of error, so there's probably a 5% chance on either side that either Harris wins and relatively easily or Trump wins relatively easily. But I think if you're a betting person, the sort of bell curve middle is that it's going to be really close. I don't think, unless you were a partisan, I don't think there's polling out there that you can point to that definitively says one person is ahead of the other. For every poll that has Trump ahead by 1 or 2 points, there's a poll that has Harris ahead by 1 or 2 points. So to me, the thing we know, I think we know, I should say, is that the closeness means we will not have a president on November 5th. We will not have a declared winner. I think we may not have one for 4, 5, 6, 7 days. I'll remind people in 2020, which was not that close an election, Joe Biden won by about 7.5 million votes. He won with 300 plus electoral votes. It took 4 days to call the election for Biden. So, if 4 days is kind of the floor, I could see 7, 8, 9 days being the ceiling. And unfortunately, given where we are in this country, that worries me a little bit in terms of people assuming that the slow counting and trying to make sure we're getting it right is evidence of some nefarious plot going on, and that leads to unrest. That's sort of the thing that keeps me up at night.
But Chris, you go back to 2020, and eventually, like you said, Joe Biden won by over 7 million votes. He had a 5% differential eventually when the votes were counted. He won 6 out of the 7 swing states.
Yep.
Why? What has changed? Why is this election so damn close?
Yeah, well, you have a different incumbent in office, right? So in 2020, Joe Biden was running against Donald Trump in the teeth of a global pandemic that voters did not think Donald Trump had handled particularly well. Plus, being an incumbent in America is challenging. People don't totally know what they want out of their politicians, but they kind of know what they don't want. So Trump was not particularly popular in the 2020 election. People were not happy with his 4 years in office, but fast forward 4 years, guess what? Joe Biden is not particularly popular, and people are not particularly happy with his 4 years in office. Now, obviously, Biden is not on the ballot, right? He decided not to run, but Kamala Harris is his vice president. And, Donald Trump is trying to make this race a referendum on the Biden-Harris years. If that winds up being the case, Trump will probably narrowly win because polling suggests Joe Biden 38, 39% of the public approves of him. A majority of the public does not approve of how he's handled the big issues in this campaign, immigration and the economy. So, I think it's the difference. It's the difference of incumbency, and 4 years later, being an incumbent is not a great place to be.
When did that change? Because you look at historically the last 30, 40 years, I mean, Reagan had 8 years, Clinton had 8 years, even Bush, as unpopular as he was because of the Iraq War, he still had 8 years, Obama had 8 years. It was always conventional wisdom that, the incumbent has great advantages. But for the last 8 years or so, that's not necessarily the case. When did that switch flip?
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, it used to be that if you got elected to one term as president, you were almost certainly going to get elected to a second term. The only recent example we had prior to Trump was George H.W. Bush, and that was in 1992. I mean, that was a long time ago. I think what you have is, and I think this is not unique to America, but as it relates to the American election, I think what you have is technology driving significant change in the way that people interact with each other, interact with their world, interact in the professional space, in the personal space. And I think that change is not moving incrementally, it's moving exponentially. And I think exponential change in social structures, in how we work, in how we live, makes people uneasy. And a lot of the pillars of American life for a very long time. So the police, the presidency, media, the church, all of these things, if you look at polling, Gallup does great polling on this every year. It's like an institutional survey. Trust in all of those organizations is plummeting. So I think what you're left with is people feel unmoored. They feel a little lost. And so that creates anxiety, tension, anger, resentment. And I think that is a stew into which it is hard to be a politician. It's just people don't really know what they want. They feel like they're a bit lost. They feel like they're a bit at sea. And politics isn't, at least in this country, isn't terrific at solving big problems. We very rarely even solve little problems with politics in this country.
I want to come to, the Electoral College, and ultimately, even if Harris wins the popular vote, as we say that she will, there's a great chance that she might lose the Electoral College. Like Hillary Clinton, she won the popular vote. She got 3 million votes more than Trump, but eventually she lost the presidency because she lost the critical battleground states. Do you see 2024 going the 2016 way?
I actually think there's a lot of parallels there. I always say our tendency in America is to compare this election to the last election. And because the last election was during COVID, it's a hard comparison, candidly. The candidates didn't really campaign. We were in the middle of a pandemic. They changed voting rules to make it easier to vote. I think 2016 is a better analog. Both in terms of turnout, about 140 to 145 million people voting. And then also in terms of the closeness. I mean, look, Donald Trump won, yes, but he won by extremely narrow margins in a number of these swing states, and that contributed to the fact that Hillary Clinton won the popular vote and lost the Electoral College. I do think if I had to gamble, I would say the most likely outcome is the one I feel most confident about is I do think Kamala Harris will win the popular vote. Now, will she win it by 500,000 like Al Gore did in 2000 when he won the popular vote and lost the Electoral College? I don't know. Or will she win it by 2.5 million? Even if she wins it by 2.5 million, as you point out, we saw what that happened in terms of the Electoral College, because what really matters is where those votes are, and I think it is possible. I don't want to say it's probable, but I do think it's possible that this will be the third election in the last 24 years where we have a split of popular vote winner not being elected president, which has only happened 5 times in history. And this would be the 6th, and half of those times would be in the last 2 decades in America.
I do want to talk about that a little bit, because the Democrats say that signifies an inherent bias in the college system, where even if a Democrat wins by, in the case of Hillary Clinton, she won by 3 million more votes, but she ended up losing the Electoral College. So how does that speak to the fact that Harris today, in most polls, is leading only by a percentage or less than a percent? So Biden going into 2020 was leading by over 6%, some over 7%.
Yep. If I was the Harris team, that would worry me. Because look, tied in the national popular vote means advantage Republicans in the Electoral College. Now, we can debate how big an advantage that is for Republicans in the Electoral College. There's some data to suggest that the difference between the popular vote and the Electoral College is shrinking a little bit. Trump is probably going to do better in Democratic states, just in terms of raw vote, in Democratic states like New York or California, which may shrink the popular vote margin a little bit. But yeah, to me, it's not a great system. I think it is a little bit antiquated, but I also simultaneously think it's virtually impossible to get rid of. So it's in the U.S. Constitution, which means to get rid of it, you need 2/3 votes in the House and Senate. The House and Senate, 2/3 of the House and Senate aren't going to agree on anything. And even if they did, 3/4 of our states would have to approve of changing it to amend the Constitution. I just don't see it there yet. And candidly, just from a political perspective, if Republicans, if this happens again on Tuesday, if Republicans win 3 presidential elections in the last 24 years that they lost the popular vote on, they're not going to be keen on changing it, the Electoral College, because it's working for them. Whether we think it's an accurate representation or not, it would have helped elect 3 presidents over that 2-decade time frame.
I want to come back to the early voting, and already
Mhm.
50 million Americans have already voted either by mail-in or by in-person early voting. Is there anything in there to suggest which way this race might break?
So I think what you'll see in early vote is Republicans overperforming. Now, I think there's a tendency to say, well, if they're overperforming in the early vote, they're going to win. Maybe, but I think what's important to notice in 2020, just as an example, Donald Trump was actively discouraging Republicans from voting early. He was saying, you got to vote on election day. This time around, smartly, he's wised up and said, look, vote whenever you can. We need all your votes. So there's been a concerted push among Republicans led by Trump to get more of their voters out and bank those votes. So I don't know how much that's responsible for what we've seen in North Carolina, in Arizona, in Pennsylvania, in all these places. Republican early turnout is significantly better than it has been in the past. The question is it better and Republicans maintain their traditional significant lead among voters who vote on election day? Or is it better and a lot of those people who might have voted on election day don't because they've already voted, and therefore it kind of it evens out? Again, a couple days we'll know more about that. I'm always skeptical of drawing too many conclusions off of early voting for just that reason. It's early voting. Yes, I think about half the electorate will vote early, but remember, we don't know what vote they cast. In a lot of states, they don't even have party registrations. You don't even know if it was a Republican or a Democrat who came in to the ballot box, much less a Republican is, of course, not required to vote for Donald Trump, just like a Democrat is not required to vote for Kamala Harris. So it's a little bit of, I think it's a little over analysis of the early vote.
I don't want to talk about one particular demographic, which the Harris team is really pressing on. And I guess in the 2022 midterms, we saw them sort of becoming the decisive factor. Are women going to decide who's going to be the next president of the United States?
So this is what I'll tell you. We have a giant gender gap in this country, and we have for a long time. Men typically favor the Republican candidate, women the Democratic candidate. In my mind, if you want to see who wins this election, I really do think we can do it just by men and women. If Donald Trump wins men, and he will win men, if he wins male voters by more than Kamala Harris wins female voters, he'll probably win. If Kamala Harris wins female voters by more than Donald Trump wins male voters, she'll probably win. I'm oversimplifying slightly, but I do really think that is sort of the critical divide that we've seen as it relates to women in particular, female voters. 2 things. One, they've made up a majority of the American electorate in every presidential election since 1984. And I would expect they will again. Now, it's not 70% electorate. It's not 60% electorate. It's about 52% of the electorate, but still a majority. The second thing is, when we talk about undecided voters who still hasn't made up their mind, I think a big chunk of those undecideds are Republican women. These are people who do not like Donald Trump personally. They find him personally offensive. They don't like how he talks about or treats women, but they're Republicans. So they probably favor his policies on things like inflation and trade and immigration. And I think what you're seeing in these last couple of days is Kamala Harris trying to create a permission structure for that kind of voter to vote for a Republican. Look, you don't have to be a Democrat to vote for me. You don't have to stay as a Democrat to vote for me. You just have to vote for me in this one, because her argument is it's much more about country than it is about party. That this choice isn't really Republican, Democrat. This choice is sort of freedom and democracy versus authoritarianism. And that's how she's trying to frame it, because she wants to win over those undecided Republican women.
And don't tell your husband while you're voting.
And there is, what's so interesting? there is sort of an active campaign to do that. I thought Liz Cheney, who's a very conservative Republican, but has been an outspoken voice against Donald Trump, in a speech last week, she said, no one has to know who you vote for, which, I mean, yes, it's a secret ballot. It always has been in the United States, but very rarely do politicians and campaigns come out and overtly sort of say that. And I think that's aimed at women who live in Republican areas, who are married to a Republican man, who are sort of nervous about voting for someone who is not Donald Trump.
All right. As we come to the concluding part of this interaction, so just in these last couple of days, all this noise that we see. I mean, Joe Biden's comments calling Trump supporters garbage, and then you had a comedian making fun about Puerto Ricans. Do you see that just as noise, or does that really move the needle in terms of votes?
So my first reaction generally of stuff that happens in the last week is it's just noise. I will caveat it with where we started, which is the closeness of the election. So do I think that these things are mostly molehills and not mountains? I do. At the same time, Joe Biden won Georgia by 11,800 votes in 2020. He won Arizona by 12,000 votes. He won Wisconsin by 21,000 votes. So we're not talking about huge, and I think that's likely to be reflected in at least some of the swing states this time. So we're not talking about huge margins. And so given the narrowness of what we expect in these swing states, I'm not ready to say, oh no, none of this matters. Because, at this point, if you're an undecided voter, who knows what sort of tilts you one way or the other, gets you off the fence one way or another. So I would say as a general rule, I'm skeptical that these things that the campaigns try to make a huge deal in the last week or so of a race matter all that much. At the same time, given the closeness or expected closeness of the race, who knows?
So finally, Chris, I mean, give us something to munch on. Who is Chris putting his money on to win?
So
47.
Here's what I'll say. I have learned over the years to never put my money on anything because I'm a terrible gambler. And I think I played blackjack one time in Las Vegas and I lost $100 in about 5 minutes. And I said, that's it for me in gambling. We're not made for each other. But here's what I will tell you. If you want an early predictor, at least early in the US, early predictor of who will win the election, look at Pennsylvania. It's just, there are 7 swing states. All of them matter. The candidates are touring all of them in these last days of the election, but Pennsylvania matters the most. It is virtually impossible for Kamala Harris to win the presidency if she does not win Pennsylvania. No Democrat has been elected the president in the modern era in American elections without winning Pennsylvania. It is slightly more credible for Donald Trump to win the presidency without Pennsylvania, but only slightly so. So to me, Pennsylvania is on the East Coast of the United States. It will get votes in relatively early, and how that goes to me is what you should look for. Are there scenarios that each candidate can be elected president without Pennsylvania? Sure, but it's very unlikely. So to me, that's what I'm paying the most attention to, because I think that's what the campaigns and the candidates are paying the most attention to.
All right, Chris Cillizza, thank you very much for speaking with us.
Thank you.
News 18. Thank you.